Hello, I'm so excited, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much for joining. And if you're watching this later, also thank you for taking the time out of your, I'm sure, busy schedule to like learn about grant writing with me. It sounds like a really boring thing, but it's something that I really love to talk about and to teach about, especially with youth, like people under sort of like 25, under 30, because I was once a youth writing a lot of grants. And it can sometimes be confusing and weird and just like to understand how grants work. So um, I guess I'll just get started with like talking a little bit about who I am and like why is this guy doing this, you know? So my name is Jacq. I used to run an LGBTQ youth organization in Regina. And before then, I ran a youth organization in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, which is originally where I'm from. And before that, I was really involved in sort of youth organizing and youth advocacy, specifically with organizations that sort of practice a for youth by youth model, meaning that anything that they did was sort of led by and inspired by youth. And so through all of that work, I've also sort of become a person who's like who really not only is I think good at like navigating things like grant writing, but also actually really enjoys it. So today I'm really stoked to mentor a number of youth who have both, some of whom who like access the SASC Prevention Institute funding streams, as well as other youth in the community across Saskatchewan who are just like passionate about making a difference in their community. And I bring my experiences as a youth organizer and as someone who was really actively involved in my community as a young person into that work. And so I actually approached the SASC Prevention Institute about presenting this workshop to youth across Saskatchewan who maybe would be interested in applying for the SASC Prevention Institute funding. And the reason for that is that the youth organization I used to work for, we had a number of youth working with us who actually applied successfully and received a SASC Prevention Institute grant. And it was really, really cool to get to work with them. Like they built the application, they developed the project themselves, built the application, applied for the money, got the money, ran the project, all on their own. And it was just really cool to watch. And outside of that, within the youth organization I used to work at, we actually have like a youth leadership program where I did a workshop specifically about grant writing because it's a project about getting youth more involved in like civic engagement and like social entrepreneurship, community organizing, and learning about grant writing as a skill is a really important one. But so I had already sort of developed a workshop like this. And then I reached out to SASC Prevention and I said, I'd love to do one with youth who are sort of outside of the direct communities that I work for. And then this is how this came to be. So basically what we're going to talk about today is grants. And the big thing to know about grants is that they are really not as scary as they seem. I think that people hear, particularly youth, like hear grant and are like, what does that even mean? That feels like a really big fancy thing, but it's really not as scary as they seem. And they're really boring to write. Grant writing is like long and boring and obnoxious. You're often saying the same thing over and over again in different words. But it feels so good when you finally get a grant. And once you've written enough grants, especially if you're working with the same group of people or the same collective or the same organization, it's basically a lot of copy and pasting. And I know that like as young people in high school or university, we're told that we like shouldn't plagiarize. But when it comes to grant writing, it is totally okay to plagiarize your own grant work at your own agency, your own organization, your own club or collective. That's totally okay to do. And knowing how to write grants is a really, really important skill. And if you're able to do it, everyone will want you to get involved in their organization or in their projects because it's a skill that nobody really wants to actually practice. And so, yeah, so they can be super, super fun. So things we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about just in general, like what is a grant? Why do they exist? We're going to talk about how you find them. We're going to talk about what the grant process looks like. And then specifically about the SAS Prevention Institute youth grants, we're going to talk about like, how do you even do the thing? Like, where do I even start? We're going to talk about strengthening your grant and how you can present a really strong case to SAS Prevention about why the thing that you want to do is really important. We're going to talk about developing your project with the grant application that SAS Prevention actually has. We can talk about that in a little bit as well. We're going to talk about budgeting, which is one of like the worst parts of doing any type of organizing, but hopefully teaching a little bit about some of those concepts will help people be able to like wrap their minds around what all of those things mean. We're going to also quickly talk about how to not hate yourself if you don't get a grant that you apply for, because I think that that can sometimes be one of the most overwhelming feelings of applying for grant funding, is when you end up not getting the grant, and that's just really, really devastating. And it's really important to like practice, to practice just like not wanting to cry when you don't get a grant. And then I want to talk a little bit about some other grants that exist both in Saskatchewan as well as Canada-wide, for any types of projects that you want to get involved in or work on. So if we just get started with like, what is a grant? The first thing I'll say is that just like asking for money is weird. It's uncomfortable. It's often confusing about how to do it in the right way. And so a grant is basically where people invite you to ask for money. And then if you're successful in it, you're given money to accomplish a certain thing after you've applied for it. So the thing to keep in mind is that a grant is different than donations or sponsorship. So when someone makes a donation to your project or to your thing, you sort of didn't ask. You might have asked for a donation, but you didn't sort of set out a bunch of expectations about what you were going to do and how you were going to do it. And then a sponsorship is a little bit different, where sponsorship is actually if people are sponsoring you, it's because they want the attention. They want their name on something. And really sponsorship is more like advertising. You're selling like advertising, which is why actually businesses, like the tax write-offs for grants and sponsorships and stuff, is a little bit different. So that's just why it's important that you understand the difference between those two things, which is, I think, just an important thing to know about if you're working on like larger projects. And so, yeah, but you get grant money, and that's always just really lovely. And so I like this really just like royal picture of this cat that I like to imagine myself as when I get grant money sometimes. And also cats just like liven up the presentation. So there we go. But why do grants exist? Grants exist for different reasons. And depending on who offers the grant, it sort of might exist for different reasons. So governments often provide grants to show that they care about people, but also because people can often do programs or projects for cheaper than they can. So when we think about all of the work that it takes to like do a project, to apply for money to do the project, it can often feel like a lot of work. But if the government were to do it, it would probably cost 10 times the amount of money as it would for like a community organization. And that's just because of like bureaucracy, tons of different reasons. Yeah, so governments are one of the agencies that likes to offer grants. Corporations, like businesses, like to offer grants. And sometimes they do it because they care about people, but also sometimes because charity looks good and they get attention for it, right? So when we think about these like really big corporations that provide grants, there's, I think, a lot over the years, the way that people like our consumers, the way that customers shop at different businesses or purchase different services, people tend to be a little bit more critical about how they consume things, and often like investing in charity or providing grants is a way to sort of, for businesses to like look good. And nonprofits also offer grants, and for different reasons. Sometimes it's like for attention. They want people to know in the community about different work that they do, or it's their way of sort of showing their support to certain communities. And sometimes it's just because they want to help. Nonprofits want to help you. And it's often if ever you're sort of wondering, why is this organization or group offering a grant, a good way of figuring out maybe what their intention is to look at what the requirements are about how you recognize grants. So, for instance, if you're working with a nonprofit and they're wanting to give you money and they say, oh, but in exchange for this grant, we expect you to put our logo on something, then it means that part of their intention behind giving you grant money is to promote themselves, which is totally reasonable. That's totally fair. But if an organization or a group says, "Oh no, as long as as long as you're doing your project and it's all going great, and we get a little report, doesn't really matter if you let anybody know that we handed out the money," then that tells you a little bit about sort of what the intention is, right? And not that it really matters one way or the other, but I think it's just helpful to understand, like when you're applying for money, why someone is maybe offering you money. It's always good to like know about the strings, right? So, about how you find grants. So, I know that today a lot of you are here because you found the SAS Prevention Institute grant, or you're familiar with that grant program. But if ever you're ever looking for other types of grants, there's a number of different ways that you can find grants. My favorite kind is to just go on Google, type in your topic. So, like alcohol abuse prevention, plus Regina plus grant. And often things pop up that you would have no idea have even existed. You can also type like Canada, Saskatchewan, right? Northern Saskatchewan, maybe your tribal council, or different, whatever it is, but finding sort of a regional piece. And if you're a part of if your project ties like multiple topics, there's sometimes grants that are designed for, for Indigenous communities, or for, communities of people with disabilities, or for specific communities. It can sometimes be helpful to include those words in your Google searches. The other way that you can find a grant is you can sort of find a big company or corporation in your region and look on their website and search for words like corporate responsibility, social investment, community investment, anything about how they like give back to community. There's often some information about grants in that section of a website. And so this can be really helpful. Let's say that there's a local business in town, maybe sort of a larger business or corporation, and they recently were in the news because they did this like mental health campaign in their office, and you're working on a project and it's related to mental health, and you see them talking about this thing in the news. That means that topic is important to that business. And so finding information about their corporate responsibility or social investment pieces can sometimes help you find a grant with a business or a corporation that is like actually going to be interested in funding your project. And then the other things that you can do is sometimes you sort of have a project and you want to go search and find a grant that meets your project, which is where Googling sort of comes in there. Or sometimes you come across a grant and it's about, this grant is for, for people who are interested in nursing, who live in northern Saskatchewan. Oh, well, that's me. And this grant is for people like me, or, I'm eligible to apply for it. Is there a project that I can come up with that meets this grant? And either way is totally good about applying for grants. Sometimes it's easy to find a grant, but harder to find a project. And sometimes it's vice versa. And so just always keeping your eye out for different opportunities can sometimes go a really long way when you're trying to apply for grant money. And then the other thing that you can use is grant databases. So different sort of databases exist online, whether it's like government databases or, nonprofit foundation databases. But a lot of these databases exist and they actually charge you money to like have access to those databases. Don't pay for it. It's a waste of money, in my opinion. I know some other people who disagree, but I think it's a waste of money, especially when a lot of those things exist out online for free, particularly things like in Saskatchewan, where a lot of those grant lists exist online already. And so Finding a grant can be, yeah, really difficult and frustrating. And sometimes I feel like just like different memes. But this is like one of my favorite, like searching for memes, which is why I shared this. Memes liven up content, which is why I often include them. I'm so sorry though if you are not a meme person. Um, and oh, my animation messed up on this page. But I like to talk a little bit about grant processes because they tend to differ depending on the grant. And Zoe and Savannah at SAS Prevention can often, are like much better at letting you know the SAS prevention process for grants. But if ever you're applying for any other types of grants, this process can understanding what this process looks like can sometimes be really helpful to just like calm your worries. So the biggest thing that you do is often you just like identify or you find a grant and then you work on your project development. So you try to figure out what your project actually is or your program. And sometimes you are able to contact the grantor or the funder before you even write or submit an application. And that's always a good idea. If often the people, like people who run grants or organization who runs grants, are excited to talk to people about their potential project, sometimes you can't just because they get so many requests that they say like it's just not realistic for us to talk to every single person. But if you can, it's always a good idea to do that. And you can do that over email, totally. But I actually usually suggest trying to arrange a phone call, especially because you can get into sort of some of that nitty gritty stuff over the phone. And contacting your grantor beforehand is also really helpful because you can get a really good idea of like if your project is eligible, right? These ideas that you have, are they even going to be relevant to the grant that people are trying to apply for? And because what you don't want to do is make all these assumptions, maybe read the information incorrectly, spend all of this time working on a grant only to then later learn that it was not actually eligible based on the activities. And so being able to talk to your funder about that beforehand can sometimes be really helpful. But then you're going to write your application and then you're going to submit your application. And depending on the grant, it's going to involve a lot of waiting. And if ever you apply for a grant and you think that you've waited as long as you're going to have to wait, and so you just sort of like assume that you're not going to get the grant because you haven't heard anything, odds are you haven't waited long enough. So just keep waiting, keep waiting. Usually, most grants will let you know if you're unsuccessful. They just will let you know like 8 months later, especially if we're talking about like government grants. Governments can sometimes be really slow about handing out money. And that's like not because they don't want to be, but it's just because often they're oversubscribed and they get way more people interested in a grant than they're actually able to hand out. But while you're waiting, it's totally okay for you to follow up with a grantor or funder, send a quick email or make a phone call and just ask. Before you do that, you want to be thoughtful about maybe looking at any information that's available about the grant that will tell you, it'll take, you might not hear back for 13 weeks. Like make sure that you're not calling them when, 3 weeks later after they've told you that you're going to have to wait 6 weeks. But it can sometimes be good to follow up. And that's especially helpful when for different types of grant programs where maybe the person who's helping you work on your grant is also sometimes in the room when it's coming time to decide who gets money, because you want that person to like you. And so I worked for a number of different organizations who run grant programs. And while I was sort of a grant officer and I worked on supporting people's grants, I didn't have a say, like, I didn't get a vote in who gets money, but I was often around the table when the people who were able to make decisions were talking about different projects. And the more that someone had talked to me over the phone about their project, the more that I was able to sort of answer questions in that room, right? So if people were talking about a project and saying, oh, it's not really clear in this grant application, like how they would get the word out about their event. And I can say, oh, well, I've actually had a number of conversations with them and this is what they explained to me. Maybe that just didn't come across in the application. And so if you have a relationship with a grantor or someone who's sort of around that table, it can sometimes be helpful for you. So it's good to do that. And then eventually, once you've waited for what feels like forever, you will be notified. Sometimes not, but often you'll be notified about if you were successful or not. And depending on the grant and the size, if you're successful in getting a grant, you might have to sign an agreement that basically says, yes, I agree to spend the money the way that I said I would spend the money. And there's often some like legal stuff involved there. But I know that for the SASC Prevention Institute, when you're applying for funding as a youth through SASC Prevention, you're generally applying like with an organization or a collective, and so they sort of hold the responsibility of like accepting the funds on your behalf. But if ever that's not the case, you just want to be really thoughtful about like looking at any type of agreement or contract you have to sign and making sure that you really understand it. But then you get to do your project, which is the funnest part, arguably. But at the end, you always have to report on the results of your project. If you are applying for grant money, and you don't ask questions about what you're going to have to report on, you might sort of get into trouble later. So you want to be really thoughtful about making sure that you're collecting the information you need to be collecting throughout the course of your project to make sure that you're going to be able to successfully report back to the grant. And some people might think, well, why does that matter? Like, I already got the money. Why does it matter if I report back? But a lot of grants either hold back a portion of the money that you've applied for. They say, yes, we're going to give you, we're going to give you $1,000 for your project, but you only get 800 of it now. And once we get a report, we'll give you the rest. Or they might say, we're going to give you all the money, but if you don't report on it, you can never apply for this grant again. And that can sometimes also get you into trouble. So you just want to be thoughtful about that and make sure that you're doing the best that you can. Are there any questions before I move on into our next little bit? I'll just wait a couple seconds in the chat. Cool. Okay, if there are questions, feel free to just like pop them in the chat and I can answer them as we go. Don't feel like you have to raise your hand. So as we move into like the SASC Prevention Youth-Led Community Health Grants Program, which is what we are all here today to celebrate, I'm excited to share a little bit about my thoughts and sort of what I would suggest to make a really strong grant application. So the first things to keep in mind about this grant program is that more funders, similar to SASC Prevention, are wanting to have projects led by youth. And what that means is that more nonprofit organizations and community organizations are going to be trying to get you as a young person, as a youth, to do really cool stuff with them. And this can feel really exciting, especially if this is sort of a new thing that you're getting involved in. But what's really important to remember is that they need you way more than you need them. And so being thoughtful about, if there's a nonprofit in your community that is, asking you to get involved in the work that they're doing, but they're not really respectful to you or supportive, then it's okay to walk away. And it's okay, like you as a youth who's involved in a project, you should feel empowered and excited about what you're working on. And you should feel respected. And so all the youth that I work with, I always tell them, like, there's always going to be another organization or another adult in your community who's passionate and excited to support you. And you should always be treated respectfully. And so just like remember that might happen. And so you, with the SASC Prevention Institute funding, you as a youth should be leading any youth-led project. And if an organization or a group that you're working with doesn't let you take ownership or sort of credit for the project, aren't able to, aren't willing to have you engaged in the way that you want to be engaged, and aren't even willing to like have that conversation with you, then you can explain to them like, hey, actually, this grant that I applied for, or that I want to apply for, has to be led by youth. And so you actually need me to be a part of this project. And you're not treating me the way that I think that you should be treating me. And it's okay to walk away. And I think as young people, it can sometimes be really scary, that idea of like walking away from a project, because, well, it's new and we're excited and, we're learning. But you have the right to like feel supported and comfortable and empowered and engaged in the work that you're doing. And so I always just like to, just like remind youth of that fact. And what youth want and need way more than people who aren't youth in your community. So there are so many times where as a youth, but also now as an adult who works with youth, where youth say like, I think that this is I think that we should do something around this. And an adult will say, well, actually, this would probably be more important. And just like trust your friends and your relationships with other young people, and trust your own experience that you know what youth want and need in your community. So these are things that I always try to get kids and young people to think about and to keep in mind as they're working on any type of like youth-led project. So when it comes to the actual youth-led community health grants with SAS Prevention Institute, there are two kinds. So there's the Youth Action for Prevention, which I think is what a lot of us are here for, which is the youth-focused FASD prevention initiative that encourages youth to create resources, cool projects, activities that raise awareness of alcohol-related harms among your friends and your peers and your community. And and then there's the sexual and reproductive health sort of stream, which focuses on issues that are pertinent to sexual and reproductive health of young people and of people across the province. And this is sort of tied to Saskatchewan has pretty high rates of STIs and HIV, and sort of adolescent pregnancy. So those are parts of why these grants were established. And so when we think back, right, earlier, it's about like, why do grants exist? These are two pieces where like the SAS Prevention Institute, whose job it is as an organization to sort of decrease some of those things, right? STIs, alcohol related harms. That's why they have these grant programs, to hear from youth about really cool ideas that they think will actually have a tangible impact in their community. And the other thing to keep in mind about the youth-led community health grant with SAS Prevention Institute is that they won't give money. So their grant is not eligible for salaries or wages for facilities rental. So like renting a space to do a thing, or capital expenses. And we'll talk a little bit more about what a capital expense is when it comes to like the budget pieces, but generally capital expenses refers to like a thing that like things like buildings or like big sound equipment, things that involve like being an asset after the project is finished, that now there's this thing that like maintains value after the project. So when it comes to actually doing the thing, the first thing you have to do is just like come up with a cool idea. If you have a cool idea for a project that fits into either that youth action for prevention program or the sexual and reproductive health program, then you're good if you already have a really cool idea. But sometimes coming up with a cool idea or project can be really hard. So this is what I like to do. This is what I like to encourage folks to do. So the first thing you ask is like, what is a problem you want to solve? So look in your community. And when you think about the problem, it can be as big as you could possibly imagine, or it can be as small as you could possibly imagine. So different youth that I've worked with have said things like, well, problem in my community is that like kids have nowhere to go after school. And so, and like they're lonely and it's hard to make friends. That's a problem, totally. And then some people are like, there's not enough food in my community and people are going hungry. And that feels like a really, really big problem. And I know that sometimes thinking about really, really big problems can be overwhelming. And you're like, well, what is even going to help with that? Which is why the next question is really important, which is, what are some skills that you have? And so I've worked with youth who often are just like, I don't have any skills. And I'm always like, that's a lie. You have to have skills. So this can be a skill like, well, I'm a really good artist. Or it could be a skill like, I'm a really good guitarist. I love to play guitar. Or it could be something like, I'm really funny. I make a lot of jokes. Or it could be something like, I'm really good at making my friends feel better when they're sad. So when we're thinking about skills, it can be something like really tangible, like being an artist, or, I'm a really good cook, or I'm a really good writer. Like, it can sort of be these like tangible skills, but it can also be like just the things that you're good at. And for some people, it's like, I'm really good at making people laugh. And for some people, it's I'm really good at playing video games. And you might think to yourself, okay, well, how is me being really good at video games going to help, people in my community find food? Those things maybe are hard to draw those connections. But what I like to ask then is like, how can we use this skill to solve the problem? So if we think about video games, for example, and you know, the problem in your community is that not enough people have food to eat, and you're really good at video games. Well, if you're really good at video games, you probably have other friends who are really good at video games. So what about organizing like a fundraiser for a local food bank where you and your friends try to play a video game for 25 hours straight. And for every hour that you play the video game without falling asleep, you know, you're going to ask people in the community to donate canned goods to your local food bank, right? Like there's some really cool ideas that you can come up with about things that you're good at, even if they feel totally unrelated to the problem that you're actually trying to solve. But if you ask me, I think that there's always a way to make connections. And sometimes it's just about finding really creative people who can make those connections with you. And that's when finding a group or an agency in your community to help support you on your project comes in, right? Is if you have sort of this problem that you want to solve and you think is relevant to the Youth Action for Prevention program or the Sexual and Reproductive Health program, you can find a group or agency in your community and you can say, I have, you know, this is sort of the problem I want to solve. And I don't know how to go about that, but I'm a really good artist and I'm trying to, you know, is there someone in the agency who can help me try to come up with this project? And so think about, you know, friendship, your local friendship centers, youth center, boys and girls clubs, your school, your tribal council. There's tons of different opportunities in community to find groups or agencies that might want to help you. And this can just be as easy as like asking the adults in your community who you know might be involved in the community, if there's an organization that they could put you in contact with. And it's really important though that you make sure that they're not going to take your project from you, which might be different. You know, if you, let's say that you're just like, you regularly attend a youth program or a youth event, or, you know, or like a youth group, and they, you know, and sort of staff have an idea for a project and say, hey, is any youth interested in getting involved in that? That's a little bit different than if you come up with this grandiose idea and you bring it somewhere. But you want to be really thoughtful that if this is your project and sort of, you know, I like to, when I think back as a young person, when I had all these like projects in mind, for me, they felt like my babies or like my like pets. Like I was just like, don't take this away from me. I would be devastated. And so you know, being thoughtful about the organization that you're reaching out to, that they're willing to sort of work with you and foster, you know, in your idea and support your idea. So we have a question in the chat. What should you do if someone takes your idea? This is a really good question. And I actually came up with something to help us do that. Great question. Oh, I'm so glad someone asked that. So you can totally consider some type of agreement or contract. So I often use memorandum of understandings, which is basically a type of document. It's not totally a legal document. It's sort of like pseudo legal, where it's basically like, you know, I'm coming to this and these are the things that I'm going to be contributing. You're coming to this and this is what you're going to be contributing. And this is a shared understanding that we have. And you can put something in a written contract or agreement that says, you know, if after we've applied for this grant, we don't get it, I have the right to continue this project elsewhere or to work on this somewhere else. And that might feel a little bit outrageous that you're like coming up with some fancy contract. But think about, like, if you have a really, really cool idea that is then going to turn into this enormous thing in the community that everyone's really, really excited about, you want to make sure that people don't, you know, sort of take this idea that you had and do something totally different with it. Or gosh forbid, you come up with this really cool idea. Everyone knows that it's like your project, and then somehow you aren't involved anymore, and then someone messes it up, and then it's like, well, that was Jack's project and I guess it wasn't very good, when it's like, well, I wasn't actually involved in it anymore. And so setting up a contract or an agreement can sometimes be a good way of helping with that. And it can also sometimes be a good flag if you ask a community organization or another adult, you know, or an adult in the community to sign an agreement like that with you, and they say no, that's sort of, okay, well, do I really want to be working with this person then? And so that can sometimes be a really helpful way of doing that. But if you're sort of not feeling that, then sometimes even just like having a conversation before you sit down and having it in a verbal conversation and a verbal agreement can sometimes also be helpful. Um, but the last thing that I would say is that it's sometimes just helpful to like not get too attached to your ideas, especially if you're going to be collaborating with a big group of people. Um, so then the funnest, I think that the funnest part of coming up with cool things is coming up with a fun name. I really like puns. So like coming up with a silly pun related to whatever your project is. But the thing about being youth who are doing projects is that, and this is maybe the adults in the room are not going to like this, but adults really like hashtags because it makes them feel like they get what youth want. So they're just like hashtag girl power, and you're like, what? Why is that a hashtag? Why do we need a hashtag in this like thing that's not actually on the internet? But I like to put hashtags in my titles as youth because it makes it seem like more youth. Um, more like about young people, which really just makes me think of this meme, which is like, "How are you doing, fellow kids?" And so, actually, a really silly story about that is that I actually developed a project for youth that I put a hashtag into. And then kids made, like, when I started doing that project with youth, they all made fun of me and they all took the hashtag out every time that they were referencing it. And it was devastating for me. But I got the grant because the people funding the grant were like all other like adults. So yeah, totally. It's like someone put in the chat, ironic hashtag. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, coming up with a good name is sometimes a fun part of writing a grant. So when it comes time to actually write the grant proposal, and this is directly with sort of the SASS Prevention Institute project. So if we look at the application, and I'm just going to sort of pull this up here on my screen. So there's these two big pages here that sort of really go into detail about what the grant is, and and how it works, what kind of what kind of process we're going to be looking at, and a little bit about the application deadlines, which I believe SASS Prevention is actually taking ongoing rolling applications now, but I'm sure Zoe and Savannah will correct me in the chat if I'm wrong on that. And a little bit about sort of how you'll have to recognize the SASS Prevention Institute, et cetera. But when it comes to actually filling out the application, so all of these pieces around who the contact is, the name of the young people, the agency, all of these things, these are the things that we're going to be going over together, talking a little bit about how you come up with answers to those questions. Yeah. So if we come back here to our slides. So we have, when it comes to the purpose of your project. So the purpose of your project basically refers to the intentions that you have behind a project or action, or the reasons why you're invested in something. So why do you want to do this project? Talk about that. Don't be afraid to share a personal story. Don't be afraid to talk a little bit about what led you to think about this idea or think about this project. But it can also sometimes be really helpful to bring in research or evidence. So looking online, and not just like on Wikipedia or just like random websites, but looking at different health organizations, or sometimes using like Google Scholar, which uses like really fancy like academic writing, can sometimes be helpful. But finding reports from like the government of Canada, or finding reports from different, from like the Saskatchewan Health Authority, or finding different reports from different health organizations across Canada, can sometimes be helpful when you're trying to convince someone that the thing that you're talking about is actually important. And then we talk about including in the purpose of your project. We want to talk a little bit about your goals or objectives for the project. So what is it that you're hoping to accomplish through a project or a program that you're sort of hoping to get funding for through the SASS Prevention Institute? And then you have to describe your project. And so when it comes to describing your project, you want to ask the question like, who is my audience? What are they going to be doing? How are they going to participate in whatever it is that I'm planning? Why will they want to participate? What's going to get them to participate? Where is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? Yeah. And so a really good question here. What's the difference between a goal and an objective? And this one I always mess up. I know that one is bigger than the other and I always get them mixed up. But a helpful way of thinking about goals and objectives is your goal is generally a lot sort of bigger of, like my goal is to like get kids in my community to stop doing drugs. So that's like a really sort of big goal. An objective is something that's generally a little bit more tangible and concrete. Things like I am going to, youth in my community um, are going to be less likely to, or like over the next month, I'm going to try to decrease the number of youth who are using drugs in my community. So sort of a smaller, more tangible goal. Usually what you want to be thoughtful about when you're coming up with goals and objectives is something called SMART goals, which refer to goals that are really specific, that are measurable, that are realistic, and that are tangible, that like you can actually sort of recognize somehow. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that idea. So, which is one of the questions in the SASS Prevention Institute funding project or sort of funding application, is they ask you to talk about the overall goal of the project. And this is where I like to teach about outcomes and outputs. And while the SASS Prevention Institute doesn't directly ask for outcomes and outputs, a lot of other grant applications do. So it can sometimes be helpful to understand these two things and how they're maybe a little bit different. So an outcome is an anticipated result or change that comes from a project. So for example, youth are less likely to consume alcohol. So if my goal, like if I reach my goal of trying to get more young people to stop using alcohol, the outcome of that, the outcome of my project is that, if I do it all right, then youth are going to be less likely to consume alcohol. That's an outcome of a project. And then you have an output, and an output is a tangible, concrete, physical result of your project or program. So for example, on this same idea, maybe your output is a comprehensive list of alcohol-free youth social activities and events in our community. So you have this sort of output. You have a tangible thing that you can say, look at what we made, or look at what we did, right? So an output can be 3 youth social events. So that could, an output can actually be the social event itself, if that's what you're doing as part of your project. Or it can be something that like exists on paper or some type of product or service afterwards, such as a comprehensive list of alcohol-free youth social activities and events in your community. And so when we think about this, generally your outputs and your outcomes are tied together, and they are somewhat related to one another. And so when it comes to the overall goal of your project, being able to speak to both of these things, both outputs and outcomes, of like, if you're really successful in your project, what's going to happen? What big changes are we going to see in a community? But also outputs. What are the like tangible things? Because it's going to be hard for you as a youth in your community with a small grant from the SASS Prevention Institute to be able to show with like really fancy evidence how your project directly led to youth less likely to consume alcohol. But it's going to be a lot easier for you to say, but these are the outputs that we believe will lead to these outcomes. And these are the things that we're going to be able to present to SASS Prevention Institute. So for example, the project that I supported a number of youth working on through the SASS Prevention Institute was about developing a podcast about sexual health and healthy relationships and healthy consumption of substance use and those types of things. And so the anticipated result of that project was that that youth, particularly LGBTQ youth and Indigenous youth, would, Indigenous Two-Spirit youth would be more, would have more awareness about sexual health and healthy relationships in their community. And then the tangible evidence of that, like the output of that, was actually the podcasts themselves, right? 3 half-hour long podcasts with youth talking about these issues. And then one of the other questions that SASS Prevention Institute has in their application is that you have to make a work plan. I had someone in the comments ask, what was the name of that project? That project was called, I believe it was called Junk in My Trunk, a sexual health podcast. I don't remember sort of the lap, but I remember it was Junk in My Trunk. And I think it's on YouTube, actually. It was a 3-part podcast. It was super fun. The youth who did it were like unbelievably cool. I felt not cool enough to be hanging out with them during their project. So check it out for sure. It's a really, really fun project. But yeah, so making a work plan. This is that piece in the grant application that when we look at it's sort of this piece here. It's this piece here. So this sort of activity, target audience, time frame, resources required, person or group responsible. And sometimes coming up with your work plan can be really overwhelming, and you're just like, oh my God, how do I even start? So one of the things that I like to do when I'm making a work plan is I do it backwards. Where do I want to end up? So if I think about this idea around a comprehensive list of alcohol-free youth social activities and events in our community, that's one of the things that I want. That's sort of what my project is going to be, is like developing this list. So if I start at the end, well, the thing that I'm going to end with is a comprehensive list, right? So is this list of things, but is that all I'm going to end up with? Well, maybe I'm going to want to have some type of social media campaign, maybe an Instagram page where I highlight different alcohol-free youth social activities. Okay, so that's sort of at the bottom of my work plan. And then my next step, how am I going to get there? Okay, well, I'll probably have to develop the list. And so how long do I think that's going to take me? So then that brings me 3 weeks before that date. And then who's going to help me with that? Or am I going to do that by myself? Am I going to need other people to do that? What types of I might need a computer. I might need a phone in order to phone different local community organizations to ask them about what type of social activities they want. And slowly you'll get up to the top where it'll be like where the very top will be like starting the project, right? So coming up with receiving the grant and making a plan with the community organization who received the grant on your behalf. So sometimes making a work plan can be difficult, but I also like to think about it in terms of breaking it up into sections. So if you don't want to do it backwards, try to break it up into sections. And I usually do, my sections are, before my project. So I do, like, depending on how long my project is, usually like 3 months before my project or my event or my activity, 3 weeks before my activity, 2 weeks before my activity, 1 week before my activity, 1 day before my activity, 1 hour before my activity, and then my activity during, and then I do after my activity. And when you break it up into pieces like that, you can also sometimes sort of like, it can sometimes be helpful to just like grab a bunch of Post-its or something and write down all the different things that you might need to do, and then like put it on a wall with all of those different sections. There's tons of different ways to come up with a work plan. And depending on how your brain works, different strategies might help you. And this is really where you can, where as a youth who's involved, who's trying to come up with this project, you can really count on the community organization or the group who's supporting you on your project, and asking a staff member there or maybe a volunteer there to help you come up with that work plan. What you want to be thoughtful about, though, with your work plan is you want to be really comprehensive about it. It's always better to have more things, to have sort of provide more detail than not enough detail. And that's also important because when you apply for a grant, right, as we talked earlier about wanting to make sure that that different organizations sort of don't take your project from you. If you work on that activity plan together, and you make it really comprehensive and you make it really clear about what are all the steps that you're going to take, then it's harder for someone who maybe comes into the project later or who joins the project to help you. It's harder for them to totally disrupt what you've done because you said, well, actually we had this work plan and we need to follow it because it's what we applied for through this grant. So then you want to be thoughtful about project reporting. And so this often includes collecting responsible data. So when we think about data, we're talking about not only data like, well, how many people showed up, or how old were the people who showed up, from what community were they from, but we're also thinking about data in terms of like evaluation. So let's say that one of your project activities was hosting a youth social event once a month for 3 months without alcohol. And it was about getting youth involved and had to have fun in the community and learn about the fact that they can have fun without using alcohol. And you decide to collect some data, right? So you're going to collect things like how many people showed up, but maybe you're also going to collect data on how many people came back, right? So how many people went to your event and then came back the next month and came back the next month. And maybe you're going to try to collect data about how much people enjoyed the event. Did they actually have fun, or did they sort of show up and not really have that much fun? So maybe you're going to ask people to like fill out little surveys. So maybe handwritten surveys. Maybe you're going to do up like a Google form online. Maybe the organization that you're working with has an iPad that maybe you can just do a quick vote on at the event, where you can actually get people to fill out to like tap a button on an iPad. You can also use things like, so if one of your projects is, developing an Instagram page where you sort of do up a bunch of highlights of different youth activities in your community, sharing information with SAS Prevention Institute about like how many followers you have on Instagram, and how many of those followers, share your content every month or post to their story about your event, right? So there's different opportunities there about how you're going to report on data. But one of the things you want to be really thoughtful about before you even start your project is that question of how am I going to, what am I going to report to the SAS Prevention Institute? And how do those things tangibly link to my goals, right? If my goal is to have, or if one of my outcomes is youth are less likely to consume alcohol, but I haven't asked, in my surveys to any youth if they're less likely to consume alcohol following my event, then I actually haven't been able to give the SAS Prevention Institute any data or information about the thing that I said that I was going to be doing. So when it comes to project reporting, the other piece you want to be really thoughtful about is not giving too much data, and not collecting more than maybe what's appropriate. So for example, if I'm thinking, well, I want to see how many people return back to this event, and just to do that, you decide to collect names of people, so that you can tell, is Jacq going to come back twice? Well, I need to know, I'm going to collect a sign up sheet so that I can go back and check how many people came back again. Well, that's maybe one way of tracking that information, but then it's maybe helpful. Maybe you come up with a procedure where you're going to have people do a sign up sheet so that you can track that data, but then you're going to take that data and you're going to put it into like a Word document, and then you're going to, erase or get rid of those forms so that you don't just have a list of people's names who showed up to this event. Because when you collect data, there's responsibility that comes with that, right? Especially if data has things like, let's say that you're going to take people's email addresses so that you can send them information about future events. But if you just like leave that piece of paper lying around, then you're responsible for that data that you've collected on that piece of paper. So it's really important that you're thoughtful about that. The other thing, and not necessarily about the SAS Prevention Institute grant, but about other grants that you want to be thoughtful about project reporting, is this, especially with government grants, with like federal government grants, they really like to collect a lot of information about like the gender of people who participated, the sexual orientation of the people who participated, the races of people who participated, whether or not they're a Canadian citizen. Like they're just sort of really like invasive data. And sometimes you need to actually have a conversation with your funder or with a grantor and say, I think that the information you're asking me to collect is too much information, and I'm not able to collect that information. And so finding different ways to meet the requirements of a grant agreement without sort of being invasive or like invading people's privacy, especially when we think about if you're ever running an event or a project for people who are marginalized in our communities, right? So that are sort of historically or governments really like to study them or collect information about them. Just being thoughtful about the responsibility that comes with collecting data. And so this is probably the most boring part of this of this workshop about how to do budgeting for your project. And luckily, we're really lucky that the SAS Prevention Institute actually create, like, in their application, you don't even have to come up with your own budget. You just have to sort of fill out this PDF form, and all of these amounts will calculate all on their own, which is awesome. So you don't sometimes grants don't actually do that. They don't give you enough information, and they just expect you to come up with a budget on your own without any sort of handy sheet like this. So when we talk about budgeting, it's important to understand the difference between revenues and expenses. So your revenues are the things, are the ways that you're the money that you're taking in, and then your expenses is the money that you're spending. So when it comes to revenues, that's obviously like SAS prevention. That's a type of revenue, that's going to be one revenue source. But another revenue source could be donations. It could be, ticket sales, for example, if you're going to host, door donations, if you're going to host an event for youth to come to and you're going to accept donations at the door. So there's other different types of revenues. You might even find another sponsor in your community. Maybe there's a local restaurant that is really excited to donate food. So that's considered a type of revenue as well. So then you have something called cash versus in-kind. And we can see this here, right? Amount from grant program, amount expected from other sources may be in kind. So in kind refers to things that aren't actually cash, but have a value. So if we think about, for example, a restaurant that maybe wants to donate some food, they're not donating money, but they're donating food, and there's a value behind that food. So when anybody ever donates, or if you're trying to write up your budget and you're thinking, oh gosh, well, I don't have any money from anyone else. Well, ask yourself, who's helping me with this project, or who's, donated their time or different products or services, and how much is that worth? So asking someone who, maybe the local restaurant owner, and saying, so you said that you're going to donate, 5 pizzas, about how much is that worth? How much would that cost if I was to buy it from you? And then you're able to put in your budget, 5 pizzas at $15 each, right? You can put that, I'm not quick enough at math, but you can put that in your budget as an in-kind contribution to the project. And then we have the idea of capital costs. And as we said earlier, the SAS Prevention Institute doesn't fund capital expenses. So when you're thinking about, so if we think about that podcast project, for instance, that I supported a number of youth on, if we had wanted to buy like podcasting equipment that was worth a couple $1,000s, we were going to buy it and then we would use it, but it would still maintain value afterwards. That's considered a capital cost. And the idea then is that we're not actually spending the money, we're investing the money into something else. So the most common types of capital expenses are things like property. So if you were going to buy a building, which you couldn't do with a $3,000 grant from SAS Prevention Institute anyways, but also things like computers. So if you're going to buy a really nice computer for a project, well, that's actually a capital cost item. Now think about something like, a marker. Well, if I purchase this, it still maintains value. I might be able to sell this for, $1, maybe to the right person. But when I use it, like, once I use it once, it's sort of like I've spent the money, and it's not really a capital item anymore. So when you think about capital costs, it's important to look at that for any type of grant. And some grants, such as with the federal government, when you apply for money through them, they often say that you can spend certain money on capital items, but then at the end, when your project's all done, you have to sell it and give the money back, or you have to purchase it from the government, which is sometimes really confusing. And so just being thoughtful about what a capital cost item is. And if you're ever unsure, you can always reach out to the disaster prevention institute and say, we were going to do this project, but we would need to buy this really nice microphone that's worth, $400, and we're trying to figure out if this is a capital cost or not. Asking that question, that's never going to hurt, right? And then it can sometimes be really helpful to get quotes or or to get a good idea of like expected costs. So for example, let's say that you're going to purchase a bunch of t-shirts to hand out during your social event with cool sayings on them about not choosing to drink alcohol. And you want to know how much that's going to cost. You can do something, you can look online, or you can go to Walmart and sort of, look in the store and see how much money things will cost and do that up manually. But you can also call, for example, a local business who maybe makes t-shirts, and you can say, can you get me a quote for 25 t-shirts with this printed on it? Or, with some type of picture printed on it. We don't know yet, but it's going to be some type of picture printed on it. And then they'll actually get you like a paper quote that will tell you how much everything would cost. And sometimes being able to show that information to a grantor, saying we actually went out and seeked out all these quotes, then that tells them that you're really taking it seriously and you're trying to get the best value for the amount of money that they're going to be giving you. And then when you're thinking about grants, and depending on the grant, sometimes they don't cover things that are considered administrative costs. But administrative costs are things like, the cost of the paper that you're going to be writing on during an event, or the cost of the phone bill of, maybe you're going to have to phone around a bunch of different places. Administrative costs relate to costs that maybe aren't directly related to the project, about like how, they're not, like if you're using art supplies, for example, for a project, well, that's a project cost. But if you're purchasing pencils to be able to write down on a piece of paper as you're planning the project, then that's sort of more of an administrative cost. And different grants, depending on where they come from, are going to let you know if they'll cover administrative costs or not. But generally, you want to keep your administrative costs about 10%, sometimes as high as 15% of the total amount of money that you're going to be spending. But the really important thing to keep in mind is that if you're working with a nonprofit organization or a community group and they're willing to support your project, they might need some administrative costs covered. So things like, oh yeah, we're excited to have you here working with us, but you're going to be photocopying a lot, and that's going to mean that our cost of paper and ink is going to go up a little bit. And so can we work that into the budget a little bit? So having those conversations, but understanding that if you're working with an organization and they try to say, well, we're going to need 30%, we're applying for $100, we want $300, we're applying for $1,000, we want $300 for admin. Well, that's actually a little too high. And so knowing that amount is usually between 10 to 15%, I try to aim for 10%. And being thoughtful about that, but also double checking any grant, like I said, that they allow you to claim administrative costs under their grant. And remember, you can always ask for help on your budget if you need it. Don't feel like you have to do your budget alone. Budgeting is one of the hardest things to do when it comes to any type of grant writing. And so reaching out to local to like the organization or a volunteer, an adult in your community who's helping you on your project, or sometimes even reaching out to the grantor and saying, I'm having a little bit of a hard time coming up with my budget. I don't know if it's appropriate. I don't know if these costs are reasonable or if they fall into what's eligible or not. And then you always want to double check your budget. The worst thing ever is when you do up a budget and then you like miscalculate or you get a number wrong or something. And so always double checking that. And when we look at this page, sort of in the grant with SASS Prevention Institute, like I said, they ask us for 4 things: the budget item related to the project activities. So this is where you actually want to list the text description, right? So cost of t-shirts for promoting project, social media costs, maybe like in brackets, Facebook and Twitter, Facebook and Instagram ads, maybe another line about um, honorariums for an artist who's going to design a poster. So being really clear about those things. And then under that amount requested from the grant program, that's where you're going to put in how much of this money, of the money that you've asked for the SASS Prevention Institute, is going to go to those things. And then the amount expected from other sources, which is that, other either in kind. So the amount of time that someone's spending, right? Like if there's maybe someone at the organization you're working with who's willing to donate their time to support your project. You can, they can say, well, I think it's going to take me about 10 hours of my time to support you. And, my hourly wage is $20 an hour. So 10 times 20 is $200. So putting in $200 as in-kind sources under that third column there is good. The other thing, right? So if we think about some of those ineligible costs, right? So the SASS Prevention Institute says, we're not willing to pay for salaries. Well, that doesn't mean that you can't have someone get paid as part of your project. It just means that the SASS Prevention Institute won't pay for it. So you could still have that budget item. You could say, wages, and maybe you're paying 3 different youth for 5 hours of work a week for 6 weeks. And that, whatever that wage works out to, you can put into that third column there, amount expected from other sources. And so it shows the SASS Prevention Institute that you have other people, maybe a local organization, maybe a local business is donating money to support that. Maybe you have another grant that's willing to pay for those things. So you can still put ineligible things in this budget, but it's important that you make note that it's not going to be the money coming from SASS Prevention Institute that will fund that one thing. So if you finally were able to finish up your budget, which is one of the hardest things to do, congratulations. You should feel really, really stoked. But there's some really great things that you can do to make your grant stronger. I always love this picture of Britney Spears, who I try to be inspired by when I'm trying to make my grant a stronger grant. One of the really great things to do is partnerships. So if you can show in your grant application that you have partnerships with tons of different organizations, tons of different groups of young people, tons of different communities, then that shows that your project is more likely to be successful because you have more people helping you support it. It's also sometimes really helpful to try something new. A lot of funders and grantors like to fund new things called pilots. So, and sometimes some grants actually say they only fund new projects. And so they don't want to fund something that you've already done before. And so trying something new that's never been done, that's really exciting, that maybe you take in some advice from other, we did this thing that was sort of similar to this, but we're changing it a little bit and we're trying something new. That can sometimes be a good way of making your grant stronger. It's also a really good idea to try to find more than one funder. And keep in mind that when I say funder, I include people or organizations who are giving you in-kind support. So if you're thinking, oh gosh, well, I don't have another funder, I don't have anyone else who's willing to give me money, but maybe a friend is willing to donate time to design a poster for you. Well, that can be considered in-kind donation or in-kind funding for graphic design. And so finding creative ways of sort of finding additional people who will invest in your project, even just in like labor or in kind ways, can be a really good way to strengthen your project or your grant. It can also be really helpful to write a grant related to something that's really timely in the community. So if we think about like COVID-19, right? That's all anybody's ever talking about right now is COVID-19. So if you're able to come up with a project that specifically addresses things that have come up with in COVID-19, then funders get really excited about that and people want to support you on that project. There's also, maybe recently in your community, there was a situation where a young person was bullied really badly at school, and was bullied really badly at school for being LGBT, and it popped up in the news and everyone in your community was talking about it. um, Developing a project or writing a grant that's somehow connected to things that are happening in your community at any given time can be a really good way of making your grant stronger. And this is especially important for governments when you're applying for a grant related that from a government, is because governments are often called by their constituents or by the people that they represent to be responding to local issues in community. And so if you're able to come up with an idea of a solution to a project and to a problem in your community, then a government might be more excited to give you money for it because it's going to help them respond to the needs of the people that they were elected to serve. And then we have just including research, which I know I mentioned a little bit already, but making sure, while anecdotal and sort of stories from your friends or from other young people in your community is often helpful, it can also be really helpful to have research that backs that up, right? So if I say, for instance, Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of youth substance use in Canada, but I don't have any evidence that shows that. I can't say, this report from this organization says that, then it's not going to be as convincing or strong of an argument if I can't show evidence of that. So that can be a really helpful way of making your grant stronger as well. And then the last thing is having support letters. So let's say that you have, that you're working on a project in your community specifically around youth substance use in your community, and you're working on this project, and there's a local maybe there's a local you have a club at your school, like a Students Against Drinking and Driving club or something at school, who are interested in, who think that your project is really cool and they're respected in your community, who've been doing work on that, then asking them to write a support letter and to say, this project that Jacq has come up with is actually a really cool project and we really hope it happens. That can be really helpful. Or maybe finding, like, if you're working on a project, this is especially important if your project has to do with the community that maybe you're not a part of. So let's say that you are an Indigenous youth in your community and you're wanting to do a project that builds relationships between Indigenous youth and newcomer youth. So people who are new to Canada, to talk about sexual health and learn about sexual health together. Well, if you're not a newcomer youth, it might be helpful for you to maybe you have a friend who's a newcomer youth who can write you a letter and say, yeah, I actually think that Jacq's project is really cool. And as someone who would be served by this project, I think that the SASC Prevention Institute should fund this project. So that's another thing that can help really make your grant stronger. And some grants and funders actually require you to submit a support letter. And so it's really important that you pay attention to those grant application deadlines and that you ask for support letters before, the day before it's due. So if you're a procrastinator like me, there's times where I'm calling people frantically saying, oh, I didn't realize that this grant had to have a support letter. Can you write me one? And that's always really embarrassing. So trying to do that as early on as possible can sometimes be really, really helpful. When you ask someone for a support letter, they might say to you, can you write one? And then, can you write me a template and then I'll sign it? And that maybe feels a little weird. And you're like, oh, well, I don't know, maybe that's inappropriate. That's a really common thing that people do when they're writing grants or supporting each other's grants. But it's just really important. When I ever asked to do that, I don't usually put a lot of my own words. Like I sort of put in like brackets, like, put a sentence here about why your organization wants to support my project. And then another, put a sentence here about how you think this will help community. And then maybe I'll take something off their website that describes what their organization does and put it into a letter. But I try not to put my own words in it, because then you're right? It's a little uncomfortable. You feel like you're maybe putting words in people's mouths, which isn't helpful. But it is common to do that. And so just make sure, and the flip side, if ever someone asks you to write a support letter and someone gives you a template, know that you don't have to sign it, and that you can say, that you can change it, or you can actually say, you know what, I don't really think that I can write, I don't think that I actually think that this project is as strong as you think it is. But if someone does ask you to write a support letter and you think the project is cool and you think the project is worth it, it's good to write a support letter, especially because you might need one later too. So if you always say no when people ask you to write support letters, it'll be harder for you to get one when you need one. So supporting each other and your friends and your colleagues and other youth that you know who are working on this kind of stuff can sometimes be really helpful. Yeah, and honestly, the last thing that I want to talk about is really just like, don't be hard on yourself if you don't get a grant. Grants are just so competitive. It's often really hard to find money. I know that the SASS Prevention Institute, because of COVID, they're looking to be able to support projects. So I don't know that they're as competitive as some other grants, but it can be sometimes really overwhelming to apply for grants and not get them. But just keep in mind that they're really competitive. And sometimes it's actually helpful for you to ask the grantor, so you have $100,000 to distribute in grants. How much, what is your regular annual request? Like how many grants applications do you actually get? And if they say, oh, well, we normally get, $600,000 worth of requests every year, then that gives you a good idea. Okay, so I really won't feel bad if I don't get this money. And often that's what it works out to be. But also, just like, capitalism is weird. There's never enough money to go around for all of our different stuff and for all of the really, really cool things in the community. It can sometimes be really helpful if you don't get a grant, to ask why. Sometimes it's it's like, oh, your project was really cool, but it was just a bad year. We had way more that were just like more interesting for us, or that we hadn't funded. And if you ever get that feedback, it means that you should apply again the next year. And you can often apply with the same project. But maybe the advice is, well, you weren't really clear about, it wasn't super clear how youth were going to be as involved in this project. But sometimes funders are just wrong. And so, for an example, I remember I applied for a grant once and I didn't get it. And I called them and asked why. And they said, well, we already fund a project like that. And I said, oh, like, which one is it? What is it? Because I'd really love to reach out and get involved. And they told me, and I reached out, and it was nothing like the project that I came up with. And so sometimes funders just don't misunderstand that. But what that taught me is that I needed to be clearer in my grant application about how my project was different than anything else that existed in the community already. But the last thing you should do is just apply again. Keep applying, especially if you've already written the grant once. Why wouldn't you just submit it again? You never know, right? Maybe that year they got less applications. Maybe their priorities shifted, and when you applied for the grant 2 years ago, they weren't really they weren't looking to prioritize projects that supported like newcomer youth, but maybe now they are. And so it's always good to just keep applying. But what I like to say is you should just try to do your project anyways. Often, as you're coming up with a project, and like a lot of the work involved in coming up with something cool, you have to do to write a grant anyways. And so you've already done all this work. You've done up a work plan. You've come up with, different people in the community who want to donate to you. So there could be ways for you to just do your project anyways. And when you think about that, you can also just apply for different, you've done all this work already. There's maybe another grant in the community that actually is really similar to the SASS Prevention Institute grant, and maybe you could get funding from somewhere else. So don't worry about, like, if you don't get funded, that's totally okay. And there's ways to address that. So the last thing I wanted to do is just offer a couple other little grants similar in size, about that $1,000, $2,000 grant. And so the biggest one that I would really suggest you check out is risingyouth.ca. This is a Canada-wide grant, and they have grants as low as $250, as high as $1,500 for projects that are led by youth. If you're in Regina, and I believe that actually RPIRG supports projects outside of Regina. RPIRG is the Regina Public Interest Research Group, and they have micro grants available as well, just like for a few $100s for different things. If you're around Saskatoon or sort of in central or northern Saskatchewan, the Sask Lotteries has a community micro grant. SaskTel, if you have a project related to like cyberbullying or like online safety, they have up to $1,000 grants for youth. The Saskatchewan Arts Board, if you're an artist and you're interested in doing cool art projects related to sexual health or social justice or Indigenous rights or whatever it is in your community, the Sask Arts Board has some micro grants as well that are rolling the first of every month. And the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan also has some micro grants that are really cool. And then the last, if you have this idea for like a really enormous project, these are some really big grants that exist. So I'm talking about like tens of thousands of dollars. And so if you're maybe an older youth who, you've done a couple micro grant projects already and you're interested in doing something bigger, then these are some other funders or grants that are available to young people, and I mean to any age. But the ones that are specifically for youth is the Canadian Roots Exchange Creation Community Grants. Those are grants specifically for Indigenous youth and collectives of Indigenous youth who are interested in doing projects supporting their communities across the country. And those grants, I think, range from from like $10,000, $25,000 to $80,000. So like those are enormous. So if you have if you know a group of young people who would be really interested in applying for some of that money, that could be really cool. And Heritage Canada also has a grant for youth initiatives related to multiculturalism. So while the SAS Prevention Institute funding is specifically around, that like youth action prevention and the sexual health and reproductive health program, if you have other ideas, there's always grants out there that would be stoked to support the work that you're doing. So that was it for me. Thank you so much for listening to me. Holy cow, for an hour and a half. I hope I didn't bore you. And I hope that people appreciated a couple of my memes. I'm stoked to take any questions, or if you have any comments and you're like, that was dumb, you like said that one thing and I think you're wrong and this is what I would suggest instead, you can totally do that and I will not take any offense to it at all. They have one question here. Have you ever submitted videos with your reports, such as testimonials? So I actually haven't. And I think a big part of that is just because a lot of the funders, a lot of the grants that I apply for are not as cool as the SAS Prevention Institute and are not as stoked to like get sort of like non-traditional reports. But that is something, like if that is something that the SAS Prevention Institute would be excited about, that is a great thing that you can do. And I would actually probably encourage you to come up with ways that you can actually work that into your grant itself. So or work that into your activity itself. So if we think about that, remember, I was sort of throwing around this idea about like, a comprehensive list of like youth social events without alcohol. So maybe, at these different social events that you maybe are hosting, you ask people to share, a 10-second, like, like camera, phone, video about, why they like to have fun without alcohol. Or did you have fun at the event tonight, right? And you can just sort of record that with your phone. And as long as you make sure that those people give you permission to submit their video or something as a testimonial, I think that can be a really great way to show engagement with your project and to show the SAS Prevention Institute that people thought that your thing was cool. So that's a really, really great idea. Someone else asked a question, what do you do if you're not sure if your idea is good enough for a grant? That's another really great question. And I think that this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how you can always reach out to the funder and you can ask those questions. And so with the SASS Prevention Institute, you can look on their website and find the contact information for the grant. And I bet you it's actually also just like in the grant application that you probably have access to. So here you can email info@sassprevention.ca, and you can just say there, like you can say to that person, to that email inbox, I'm looking at submitting an idea for the SASS Prevention Institute Youth Action Prevention Grant, and I'm not sure if it's a good idea. Is there any way that I can talk to someone about this? And unfortunately, often with the way that grants work, sometimes that means that you have to have a phone call. And I know a lot of youth who hate, I know a lot of adults too who hate having phone calls. So just be ready. You might have to jump on the phone. But it's also totally fine for you to just write up a little description of your project, send it over email and say, hey, can you have someone look at this and let me know if my project is a cool idea? What I will tell you though, is that if you think your project is a cool idea and you are a youth, then it most likely is good and it most likely is cool. But if you're not sure, talk to your friends about it and say, hey, I have this really cool, I think I have this idea, but I don't know if it's good. I don't know if other people would like it. And your friends will tell you if they think it's cool or not. But odds are it is good if you had the idea, because you yourself are a young person in Saskatchewan who's impacted by all these same things that other youth are. And if you think it's something cool, then I'm sure that other youth will also think it's cool. Yeah, are there any other questions? Tons of good stuff in the chat. Thank you so much. Any other ones? Cool. Okay, well, I was gonna have some time for brainstorming, but it looks like we're sort of out of time. But if ever you want to ask me for help on future grants, I am so excited to support youth across the province in writing a grant application, helping you brainstorm cool ideas. It might even be something that I'd be excited to help support you with. And you can email me. You can also text or phone me. And I know a lot of people like to text instead. So feel free to text me and just let me know, hey, I went to your workshop with SASS Prevention Institute and I had this idea and I'm really self-conscious and I don't want to talk to the SASS Prevention Institute about it, but can I talk to you about it? I'd be so excited to hear about your cool ideas, and I'd even be stoked to help you brainstorm even more. So the other thing that I'll say is if you have better memes that I can add to this presentation or other silly pictures to make it more engaging, also feel free to send me those. Or if you just find a meme that you think is funny and you want to send it to me, I always appreciate good memes. So thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out and listening and learning about grant writing. I'm hopeful that you found it interesting and engaging. And I'm hopeful that you're going to apply for a SASS Prevention Institute grant. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen, but I might invite Savannah or Zoe to just jump on and offer some more information about any deadlines or other things that you want to be thoughtful about if you're interested in applying for a SASS Prevention Institute grant.
Thank you so much, Jacq. That was such a great presentation. So much information. Really, really loved it. You covered it all. So our grant, thank you so much for going over it all. During the pandemic, we've decided to really open up the deadline. So that can give everyone a lot of time to be flexible in creating their ideas and maybe mobilizing your community and your friendship circles and any other people that you know, and giving you a chance to reach out to organizations. We know that it was really tricky earlier on in the pandemic. We didn't know what was going to happen. So we want to make sure that you have the flexibility to apply when you're ready to do it. And then we'll be here and ready to go over all of what you're doing. If you need support, as Jacq said, reach out to me or Zoe. We love talking about projects. We love helping you strengthen it if you need to. We want to help everyone in this province make their ideas come to life.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Zoe, did you have anything else to add?
I was just going to add too that if you ever have any questions on how to adapt a project idea that you have to like certain restrictions that you have in your community right now in terms of like gathering in person or if there's any need to kind of brainstorm on how you can adapt to make it more COVID friendly, we're also happy to help you with that. We come up with kind of a list of ideas of projects that we've seen and some ideas that we've seen coming out of communities. So we're happy to also support that.
Awesome. That's so exciting. Well, thank you everyone for joining either today or watching at a later time. And once again, make sure that you reach out to the SASS Prevention Institute and apply for one of their really awesome grants. So thank you so much. And make sure to reach out to info@skprevention.ca. Thanks so much. And I hope that you have a lovely summer here in Saskatchewan.